All right, good morning. We are studying Masechet Pesahim, Daf Kafchet 28. We're going to start on 27b in the middle. First, we're going to speak about the sources for burning chametz according to the Yehudah, and then the other opinion, which says you can crumble it into the sea. Discuss that a bit, and then we're going to get to the next Mishnah, which is really foundational. The question is, when is chametz actually prohibited, and what are the sources for each of the opinions? So. Talmud is pretty straightforward and also very important. So let's get right into it. There's a machloket in the previous Mishnah how to destroy the chametz. Rabbi Yehudah says you must burn it, right? What is his source? As opposed to Chachamim, they say you can destroy it in any way. You can throw it into the wind, into the ocean. So let's see. Tanya Amar Rabbi Yehudah. En biur chametz ela serefa. Vadin noten. Uma notar sheno bebal yedeh o bal yimaseh ton serefa. Chametz sheyeshno bebal yedeh o bal yimaseh. Lo kol sheken shetaon serefa. Okay, so he's going to first learn it from a kal vachomer. Notar means an animal sacrifice that's left over past its due date and no longer can be eaten. That has to be burnt. Now, in that notad, there's no prohibition to not see it or have it. If you have meat that was left over, you're not allowed to eat it, but you can have it around, you can own it. And yet it requires this high level of destruction by burning. So chametz, which has a stringency that you cannot have it, you cannot see it. All the more so, this must be burned. All right, that makes sense, but he is refuted. Amru lo kol din shata dan techilato lachmir v'sofo lakel eno din. This is an important principle that a kal vachomer, if a kal vachomer is going to result in a leniency to the thing that was supposed to be more strict, then it's not a good kal vachomer. And what leniency would it lead to here regarding chametz? Lo masa esim l'sorfo yehe yoshevu batel. What if you can't find firewood? So now you're just going to be looking around, you're going to be sitting there doing nothing. Torah says you have to get rid of it. So in this case, a chumrah actually leads to a kula. By me machmir and saying you have to burn it, well then if it's difficult to burn, you can't find the means to do it, then you're going to end up violating the whole principle. Therefore, if a kal vachomer is going to lead to the thing that was supposed to be chamur end up being kal, then the kal vachomer is not valid. Bechol davar shata yachol lehashpit. The Torah says destroy it in any way that you can destroy it. That's the Chachamim. That's what Chachamim think, and that's how they refute the kal vachomer. So. Rabbi Yehudah thought about it some more and came back with a second try. Chazar Rabbi Yehudah v'dan din acher. Notar asur b'achila v'chametz asur b'achila. Ma notar b'srefa af chametz b'srefa. This is not a kal vachomer, but actually comparing two equal things. Notar, the leftover meat, you not allowed to eat. Chametz also you're not allowed to eat. So they're similar. And therefore, if the first one you can't have to burn, so to the second one you have to burn. Because now the kal vachomer, it's not saying it's any stricter or less, it's just comparing the two, kind of like a mem asinu. Rashi says here that it's a gezerah shava, which is very interesting because then others say, well, Rashi, no, it's not. A gezerah shava has to be with the words that are the same. And here it's not quoting any words in the Pisukim that are equivalent words. But I think Rashi is correct, because actually the original Gezerah Shava is a Mishnah in Betzaz has a Gezerah Shava also that doesn't quote words. The original Gezerah Shava is also conceptual. And you have Kal, Vachomer, Gezerah Shava. It's a triplet, something that is more stringent, less stringent, or equal in nature. And you can learn from all three types. It's a listing that you find in Greek sources as well, in Greek handbooks of rhetoric. This does definitely looks like that. And in this case, just because something that has a leniency that will lead to, that doesn't matter, because that stricture, it only applies to kal vachomer, not to a gezerah shava or a mem asinu, this comparison. Okay, so Chachamim, however, do not like this one either. Amru lo nebela tochiach sha'asura b'achila ve'ena te'unat serefa. There are lots of other things that are prohibited to eat, like a nevela, an animal that died without shechita. And that's not, you're not allowed to eat that, but you don't have to burn it. Actually, nevela, you're allowed to give it to a non-Jew to eat. So Amar lehen hefresh. Rabbi Yehudah says, no, it's different. Notad asur b'achila u'behana'ah. Chametz asur b'achila u'behana'ah. Ma notad ton tzirifa, av chametz ton tzirifa. So that is going to strengthen the comparison between chametz and notad, because both of them, you're not only allowed to, not only can you not eat it, you cannot derive benefit from it. And so therefore, notad, just like notad has to be burnt, so too chametz has to be burnt. Not so nevela. Nevela is not a problem of hana'ah, and so that is not as similar as notad. So the Chachamim come back and attack Rabbi Yehudah and say, well, we have another comparison, an ox that was that gored, that killed, and then the ox had to be stoned. You're not allowed to derive benefit, eat it or derive benefit from it. And yet that ox, it does not have to be burnt. So why not compare the chametz to the ox rather than to notar? Rabbi Yehudah answers, there's an extra similarity between chametz and notar, that not only are they prohibited in eating and benefit, but also if you do eat it, then the punishment would be karet, and that's true for notar and chametz. It's not true for shor haniskal. So that's why I'm comparing those two. Ma nota bisrefa, chametz bisrefa. Amru lo, chelbo shel shor haniskal yochiach. The rabbis didn't give up, and they say, well, there is a case where you have all three, which is the same. The ox that's stoned, it's chelev. Anytime you eat chelev of any animal that's prohibited fat, that's karet. So the chelev itself gets karet, and you're not allowed to eat it and not allowed to derive benefit from it because it's part of shor haniskal. And so therefore, that has all three criteria. Yet it doesn't get burnt. So why not compare this one to chametz, and then you wouldn't have a source. Okay, so that is that's a good question. And then the Yehudah thinks about it some more and comes up with a third approach. Chazar Rabbi Yehudah vedano din acher. Notar yeshno bebal totiru vechames bebal totiru. Ma notar bisrefa af chames bisrefa. Okay, Notad has a law that you cannot leave any left over, and Chametz also has a leftover rule. In other words, Chametz that I had in the morning of the 14th, if I continue to have it past noon, then I will violate. Right. So both of them have a time factor that it becomes prohibited after a certain time, and so that's the comparison. So just like this one is serefa, so to the other has serefa. And now the rabbis don't accept that one either. Amru lo, asham talui v'chata ta'of ha'ba'al safek. Lidbarecha, yochichu shehen beba'al totiru, shanu omerim bisrefa, v'ata omer bikfura. Shatak Rabbi Yehudah. So they said, oh, there are other things also that have a time limit. One of them is asham. Asham is a sin offering for certain sins, but this one is talui. If you're not sure, I'm not sure if I sinned or not. So I can't bring a regular chatat. I bring this one. Or if someone has to bring birds, like a woman who had a miscarriage, but she's not sure if it was viable, it was actually a baby or not, and so she has to bring birds, but she's not sure. So these birds that are brought out of a safek, in this doubtful case, they also have a time limit. And the Chachamim are telling Rabbi Yehudah, according to you, right? Because you say that, we say that it has to be burnt. The Chachamim say those sacrifices have to be burnt if they're past due. But you actually say that they have to be buried. And so now you brought a proof, and your proof actually works against you, because if you're going to compare chametz to other things that have a time limit, well then, just as you can compare it to a regular case of notad, which is burnt, you can equally compare it to these types of sacrifices, which are buried. And according to that, you would have to go and bury your chametz. And so Rabbi Yehudah did not have an answer. Shatak Rabbi Yehudah, and he was quiet. Okay. Since the rabbis used Rabbi Yehudah's own argument against him, so a couple of comments about that. Some folk saying, Zamar Rav Yosef, Haynu da'amre inashe, kapad hata nagara, begavan nisrof hardela. And the spoon that the carpenter made, he burnt his own palate. The mustard that he has in it will burn his own palate. In other words, he created something, and the very thing that he created comes back against him. Or another folk saying, Amar Abaye, Saddana besadne yatev, middevil yedeh mishtalem. The person who made the stocks has to sit in the stocks, the stocks that you put your arms and head in. So the person that made it, if he gets punished, he's going to have to get punished with his own handiwork. Or another version, Rava Amar Gayyara Begire Miktel Midevil Yede Mishtalem. The person that made the arrows is going to be killed by the arrows. He's repaid through his own handiwork. And so too, the Yehudah, through his ingenuity and coming up with some proof for himself, actually ended up providing a challenge that the Chachamim could use against him. All right, so that's Rabbi Yehudah's 3 attempts at deriving proofs. Although Chachamim didn't accept them, it definitely is possible that Rabbi Yehudah did accept even the first one, the Kal Vachomer at the beginning, even though we said it can lead to a leniency. Perhaps Rabbi Yehudah felt that Kal Vachomer like that is fine, but he wanted to add more to try to convince his colleagues. He didn't convince his colleagues, but he didn't change. It doesn't mean he changed his mind himself. All right, now we get to Chachamim Omrim Mefarer Vezoreh. So they say you do not burn it. You don't have to burn it. You can crumble it and throw it into the wind. We're going to question this language. Mefarer Vezoreh Layam. Ibaya lehu hachi akamad Mefarer Vezoreh Laruach u Mefarer Matir Layam. O dilma Mefarer Vezoreh Laruach aval Matir Layam be'ayneh. The question is, when it says you have to crumble it, you can crumble it and throw it to the wind, or throw it in the sea. Does that mean and or? Does that mean you crumble it and throw it into the wind? Or you can crumble it and throw it into the ocean? But either way, you have to crumble it first. Crumbling is an essential part, whether you're throwing it into the wind or putting it in the sea. Or, put the comma differently, is it that you crumble it and throw it into the wind, or you can throw it into the ocean whole, right? The difference would be if I throw it whole into the wind, it's not going to go anywhere. It's a loaf of bread, I throw it into the wind, it's just going to drop in front of me and it's still going to be there. So you got to crumble it in order for the wind to take it away. But when I throw it into the sea, even if I throw a whole loaf, it's going to get all mushy and disintegrate on its own. So that's the question. Do I have to crumble it before throwing it into the sea? Well, we can compare it to another very similar Mishnah. Tenan name gabe avodah zara ki hay gavna. Rabbi Yosef omer shochek vezoreh laruach o matil layam. So if you have an idol and you want to destroy it, how do you do it? So you grind it and throw it into the wind, or you throw it into the ocean. So into the sea. And we asked the question on that Mishnah also. Does the grinding go on both clauses? And if I want to throw it into the sea, I have to also grind it first? Or does the grinding only go on throwing it into the wind, but I can throw it into the sea as a whole idol? And the sea will take care of destroying it or hiding it. So that was the question there. And now we have 2 answers. Amar Rabba. Meistabera avodah zara del yam hamelach ka'azla la'ba'e shechika chames t'lishan harot ka'azel ba'e perur. Rabba says there's not the same answer for avodah zara and chametz. Avodah zara, they would tend to throw into the Dead Sea because nobody goes, there's no boats, no fishermen, and so once you throw it in there, it's going to be gone forever. So that's how you should really destroy it. And since you're putting it there, you can put it whole, and no one will ever find that that's considered destroyed. However, chametz, you throw it to any body of water, whatever is near you. And so therefore, maybe it's some hard chametz. Maybe it's just wheat kernels that got wet. And someone might find it. And so therefore, if you're throwing it into not the Dead Sea, then you do have to grind it up. Rav Yosef, Rav Yosef, his colleague, says, I think the opposite. Avodah zara de la memisa ba'e shechika chames de memis la ba'e perur. Idols, which are made out of clay or stone, they don't disintegrate in the water. They could be down there for many years, and then someone can fish them out and then use it again. So idols you have to grind, but bread is going to disintegrate on its own once it gets wet, and so bread you don't need to. So even though both Mishnayot have the same language, each of these Amoraim are interpreting them in different ways. Okay, Tanya Kivated Rabba, Tanya Kivated Rav Yosef. Each of these two Amoraic opinions has a baraita that backs them up. Tanya Kivated Rabba, היה מהלך במדבר מפרר וזורע לרוח, היה מהלך בספינה מפרר ומטיל לים. So Rav Yosef is the one that said that hametz always has to be crumbled, even if you're throwing it into the sea. And you see, this baraita is talking about chametz, and it says whether you're on dry land and you're throwing it into the wind, or you're on a boat and you're throwing it into the sea, you have to crumble up the bread. So you see that fits Rabbah. Tanya Kivated Rav Yosef, המלך במדבר שוחק וזורע לרוח, המלך בספינה שוחק ומטיל לים. Rav Yosef's baraita is talking about idols, because the word shochek means you're grinding it. Has to do with something that's a hard material like clay. So that's, if you have an idol and you're in the desert, then you grind it and throw it into the wind. If you're on a boat, you grind it and throw it into the ocean. So you see that he's talking about that backs up his opinion, that idols you always have to grind. Okay, so now they each have something to back them up, but that's also a question on the opposite opinion. Shechika kashya Rabba. The second baraita has a question on Rabba. Perur kashya Rav Yosef. The first question is the first baraita has a question on Rav Yosef. Shechika Rabba la kashya hal yam hamelach hal ishar neharot. So we don't have a problem for Rabba because the Mishnah that talked about that you have to grind it up. That was talking about when you're throwing it into the so when the Mishnah says you don't have to grind it up, that's talking about that you're throwing it into the Dead Sea. And the Braita here that says you do have to grind it up, that's talking about if you take the idol and you throw it into another waterway. And in that case, you do have to grind it up. So that's how he can explain this Braita. And Perur Rav Yosef la kashya ha bechite ha benahama. Rav Yosef could also explain it, that this Braita that is more machmir in his opinion, that's talking about if you're dealing with wheat kernels that are hard and they are not going to get disintegrated in the water. But the Mishnah was talking about just bread, which will, and so that's the standard case in which you don't have to crumble it up if you're throwing it into any body of water. All right, and that concludes that discussion of the Mishnah. And now we move on to the next Mishnah. Chametz shel goy she'avad alav ha-pesach mutar b'hana'ah v'shel Yisrael asur b'hana'ah shene'emar lo yera'eh lecha se'or. Okay, chametz that you don't own and no Jew owns it. It was owned by a non-Jew on Pesach. And now Pesach is finished, and the non-Jew comes after Pesach and brings you some bread that he owned on Pesach. You're allowed to benefit from it. You can eat it, you can buy it, sell it, that's fine. However, if a Jew owned it on Pesach, even if not you, if it was owned by a Jew on Pesach, then you're not allowed to derive benefit from it, right? That's very important. Like, if there's a Jewish-owned supermarket that has chametz on Pesach, then you're not allowed to buy from it even after Pesach. The reason is, lo yera'eh lecha se'or, because you cannot see chametz lecha, that's owned by a Jew. If it's by a non-Jew, it's fine. That's the Mishnah. Okay, Mishnah only brings one opinion here, you see. However, we're going to see that the Baraita has three opinions in this regard. And what we're going to try to figure out is whose opinion does the Mishnah actually follow? So that's the first question. Mane matnitin, who is the author of this anonymous Mishnah? Lo Rabbi Yehudah, ve'lo Rabbi Shimon, ve'lo Rabbi Yosei Galili. Okay, this is a great opening. It can't be anybody. No one can be the author of this Mishnah. None of these three opinions. Well, why? What do they say? Ma'hi detanya. We have a baraita. Chametz ben lifnei zemano ben la'achar zemano ore oved alav belav. Toch zemano oved alav belav v'karet. Dibre Rabbi Yehudah. So Rabbi Yehudah says that chametz before its time and after its time. That's expression that means before Pesach starts or after Pesach finishes. In other words, before Pesach starts is from noon until sunset on the 14th. And after Pesach is Chametz Shavar Alav Pesach. In both those cases, there's a lav, right? A simple prohibition. The Torah says you may not eat chametz, own chametz during that time. Here it says eat. Later we're going to clarify it means own as well. During Pesach, toch zemano, then the same prohibition applies, except that the punishment is greater. On Pesach, if someone eats chametz, then that would be karet. That's what Rabbi Yehudah says. So it's prohibited in all three time periods, before, during, and after. Before and after, it's only a lav, which would not be punishable, only by lashes. And in the middle time, during Pesach itself, is karet. Does that fit with the Mishnah? Well, the Mishnah says that you're not allowed to. Mishnah doesn't talk about before Pesach. It just talks about if someone owns something on Pesach, then it cannot be eaten after Pesach. And that does seem to fit what Rabbi Yehudah said. Okay, we're going to get to this more tomorrow, the actual authorship. But today we're going to talk about the sources that each of these Tanaim bring to back them up. But remember this question, which we will answer tomorrow. Okay, Rabbi Shimon, that was opinion number one. Opinion number two, Rabbi Shimon omer chametz lifnei zemano ulachar zemano eno oved alav belo kelum toch zemano oved alav bekaret ubelav umishah. Okay, period. So Rabbi Shimon is more lenient, and he said the time period before Pesach starts and after Pesach, there is no prohibition at all, which is quite amazing, right? I think the straightforward reading of Rabbi Shimon is that you are allowed to have chametz on the 14th, the entire day, right up until sunset. When Chag HaMasot starts, when they're actually eating the Korban Pesach, which is at night, that's when you can't have chametz. Before that, in the afternoon, you are allowed to have chametz. And how about after Pesach? After Pesach, even if a Jew owned chametz during Pesach, which they shouldn't have done, but if they did, then after Pesach, it's permitted. There's no prohibition of any chametz, no matter who owned it, after Pesach. So Rabbi Shimon only talks about Pesach itself, those 7 days, sunset till sunset. That's the only time when chametz is prohibited. Okay, now the Gemara interrupts the Braita to add a clarification. Right, actually this is the words of the Braita. The Braita adds, and from the time that it is prohibited in eating, also is prohibited in having benefit, right? That's the words of the Braita, saying that the prohibition of eating and benefit occurs at the same time. Now, who does that explain? Well, it could fit with Rabbi Shimon's opinion because he doesn't think that there is any time beforehand, so everything starts at sunset. But actually it fits as a better explanation for Tanakama, because Tanakama said there's different levels. And so at noon, first there's a lower level, just a lav, and then at sunset, an extra prohibition kicks in, and now it's with karet. And so now it's clarifying that don't think that the first period is only eating, and only afterwards it becomes asur b'hana'ah. No, at noon, it's not allowed to eat or to have benefit. Those two kick in at the same time. And so even though this clarification comes after Rabbi Shimon, it applies also to Rabbi Yehudah, even mainly to Rabbi Yehudah. Okay, that's the second opinion. Third opinion, Rabbi Yosef HaGalili Omer, so he's even more lenient. He says not only is there no prohibition before Pesach starts, before sunset, and there's no prohibition after chametz, even if you owned it, and even on Pesach, chametz is only not allowed to eat, but there's no prohibition of benefiting from chametz. So you can benefit from chametz, you can use it, you can sit on it, you can sell it. All those things would be allowed. That's a surprising opinion of Rabbi Yosef Galili, but remember, he also allows people to eat chicken cheeseburgers. Okay, so that's so those are the three opinions that we set out. Okay, minayin leochel chametz mishesh sha'ot ulema'la שהוא עובר בלא תעשה, שנאמר לא תאכל עליו חמץ דברי רבי יהודה. And that brings a source. Rabbi Yehudah is the one that says the prohibition starts from noon on the 14th. How does he know that? Well, because the pasuk says lo tochal alav hametz. The pasuk right beforehand is talking about Korban Pesach. So lo tochal alav means don't eat with the Korban Pesach chametz. Korban Pesach, you already start preparing during the afternoon of the 14th. And that's why the prohibition of chametz starts before sunset during the afternoon. Okay, this seems like a very good proof by the Yehudah. Amar lo Rabbi Shimon, וכי אפשר לומר כן, והלא כבר נאמר, לא תאכל עליו 5 7 ימים תאכל עליו מסות. I can show you the whole pasuk here, right? Right before we're talking about Korban Pesach. Then it says, lo tochal alav, that's Korban Pesach. Fine, that's the Yehudah's proof. 5 7, but then it goes on. 7 days, eat upon it masot, right? And so on. So you see, it's connecting chametz to the eating of matzah. When is there a commandment to eat matzah? That's only after sunset at night. And so therefore he says, can you say that? That's talking about the afternoon, since the rest of the pasuk is talking about eating matzah. Therefore that is only from sunset and on. So what's Rabbi Shimon going to do with the word alav? That sounds like it's talking about Korban Pesach. בשעה שישנו בקום אכול מסע, ישנו בבר תאכל חמץ. בשעה שאינו בקום אכול מסע, אינו בבר תאכל עליו חמץ. Right, so we can explain, לא תאכל עליו, don't eat together with it. The truth is that you prepare the Korban Pesach in the afternoon, but you eat it at night with the masa, right? They take the masa, which would be soft bread, and make a lafa shawarma sandwich, and eat it together. So it's clear that would be that is talking about actually at night. And Rabbi Shimon has a very good point. Truth is, this chametz, this pasuk is quite difficult because you have to eat all 7 days with masa, but actually we don't have a commandment to eat masa for 7 days. Only for the first night you have to eat masa. But the commandment of chametz is all 7 days. So by this connection does suggest that there's something to his interpretation that is connecting chametz to matzah in order to tell you that time period. Okay, good. Now, so now they gave their initial explanations. Now we're going to look further, right? So far, the Yehudah in the Baraita only explains why he says chametz is prohibited beforehand, before Pesach. But what about all the other time periods? There's 3 different time periods. There are actually 3 different pesukim, and he's going to use all 3. Lo yachel chametz, bechol machmeset lo tochelu, lo tochal alav chametz. אחד לפני זמנו, ואחד לאחר זמנו, ואחד לתוך זמנו. So we're very good. We have 3 pesukim and 3 time periods, and so they'll match up. He doesn't explain how they match up, but we can more or less figure it out. He already told us one of them. So the pasuk from Devarim Tet Zayin, Lo Tochal Alav Chametz, that's talking about Korban Pesach, and so that says while you're preparing Korban Pesach, you cannot have chametz. So that's talking about the period before Pesach starts during the afternoon of the 14th. The second pasuk from Shemot Yud Bet, Kol machmeset lo tochelu, v'chol moshavotechem tochelu masot. So that's talking about on Pesach itself. First of all, it's talking about eating masa, which would be on Pesach. Also, the pasuk right before this talks about karet. So the one that's going to be the most stringent when you have karet has to be this pasuk. So that's on Pesach itself. The Gemara is going to discuss why it says kol machmetzet. It doesn't just say chametz and it says the word kol. What's that extra word doing? And how about chametz after Pesach if it was owned by a Jew? So that would be from Shemot Yud Gimel. That says, "Vayomer Moshe al ha'am zachot yom hazeh asher b'Mitzrayim be'at abadim ki b'chosek yad hosi Adonai etchem mizeh ve'lo ye'achel chametz." Chametz should not be eaten. It's a more general, passive way of discussing it, and that would be talking about chametz that was owned by a Jew after Pesach. Okay, we're also going to learn something from Hayom Hazeh, this day, which sounds like Moshe is talking about that day. Maybe that year is different from for future years. Okay, so that's the Yehudah. Now, how about Rabbi Shimon? What's it going to do with those 3 pesukim? Rabbi Shimon said the chametz is only prohibited on Pesach itself, only that time period, not before and not after. So who needs all those pesukim? Rabbi Shimon had the toch zemano. B'chol machmeset mi ba'ele lechedatanya. אין לי אלא שנתחמס מאליו, מחמת דבר אחר מנין, תלמוד לומר, כל מחמסת לא תאכלו. Okay, Rabbi Shimon says, only one of the pesukim and he actually uses the first one because he interprets, as we saw, the word alav to mean that it's talking about eating the Korban Pesach with the Masa. So at the eating time, not just the cooking time. And so this, from this pasuk, we learn the prohibition of chametz on Pesach itself. What about this one? This is not talking about on Pesach or any other time. This is coming to add that if something becomes chametz in any way, with standard way is I take dough and leave it out. There's yeast in the air that eventually will make it rise. So that's the more natural process. If I take another leavening agent and put it with it, other yeast or juice or things that will make it go, that's in a way kind of artificial. I might have thought maybe that's not considered chametz if I do it in a different way. And so this pasuk comes and says, kol machmeset, any form of leavening agent is also going to make it chametz. That's what I need that pasuk for. And then the third one, lo ye'achel chametz mibalech l'chedetanya. Rabbi Yosef HaGalili omer, minayin lefesach Misraim she'en chimuso noheg ela yom ehad. Talmud lomar lo ye'achel chametz usmich le hayom atem yoseim. The third pasuk was explained by Rabbi Yosef HaGalili. He happens to be the one who says that you're also he doesn't have any other time periods. So he explains this pasuk to say that chametz during Pesach Mitzrayim. In other words, in year one, Pesach was celebrated differently than in subsequent years. I mean, that year they're on the run and all that. So during that year, the chametz only applied for the first day, but not all the other days. And because it says, this is Yud Gimel Gimel, and the next pasuk it says Hayom Atem Yosim. This day, today you're going forth. Today chametz is prohibited, but that's it. Only this one day in year number one. In future years, it'll be 7 days. So we have to learn that historical note from this pasuk. So you see, Rabbi Shimon is able to account for all three pasukim. Okay, now that he did such a good job doing that, we're going to turn tables against Rabbi Yehudah and say to Rabbi Yehudah, where do you learn these two important lessons? So Rabbi Yehudah, how do you know that chametz that's made with other leavening agents and not just by itself is prohibited and still considered chametz? The answer is so he's going to learn from why did the pasuk say not to say kol hametz? What's with machmeset? So the pasuk itself, I need to teach me that chametz is prohibited on Pesach and has karet. But it could have said that in a simpler way. The fact that it says kol machmeset, that kind of language, that's how I learn it. So I can learn two things from that pasuk. Good. And Rabbi Yosef HaGalili minaleh, where does he learn that lesson of Rabbi Yosef HaGalili? That in the first year, they only had the prohibition of chametz for 1 day. It could be because not only does it say, it also says the word hayom right next to it. So in other words, lo yachel chametz, and it says hayom. So that day, no chametz, but no other day. But he can use the pasuk twice. He can use the phrase itself, lo yachel chametz, will teach you that chametz shavar alav Pesach is prohibited, and that word hayom connected to it teaches me that in that year it was only 1 day. That's one answer. Or maybe he doesn't learn from words that are back-to-back juxtaposition of words, and he doesn't agree with Rabbi Yosef HaGalili. Maybe that first year they did prohibit chametz for 7 days. I mean, doesn't make a halachic difference. It's only of historical interest. Okay, good. So now we're going to go back and re-quote the Braita that we had above to further analyze it. Mad mor. מנין לא אוכל חמץ בששת ומעלה שעובר בלא תעשה, שנאמר לא תאכל עליו חמץ, דברי רבי יהודה. So Rabbi Yehudah learned that chametz is prohibited beforehand from the pasuk lo tochal alav chametz, and that's during the time when you prepare korban pesach. אמר לו רבי שמעון, וכי אפשר לומר כן, ולא כיוון נאמר, לא תאכל עליו 5 שבעת ימים, תאכל עליו מסות. So Rabbi Shimon's point is, it says in the continuation of the pasuk that you have to eat masa. So, and it's putting these two things together. So therefore, he has a very good point that the prohibition of chametz must be at the same time as the commandment to eat matzah, and that's only after sunset on the 15th and not the afternoon of the 14th. So Rabbi Shimon has a good point here. Rabbi Yehudah shapir kama Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Yehudah, how are you going to answer that question of Rabbi Shimon? Doesn't say in the Braita, so we are going to try to figure out what he would have said. Rabbi Shimon amar lecha, this is very important. Nowadays, we don't have Korban Pesach. In the rabbis' days also, the Amoraim, they didn't have Korban Pesach either. Even the late Tanaim didn't have Korban Pesach. And so the question is, if there's no Korban Pesach, then is there still an obligation to eat Masah? You might think no, because the Masah and the Maror are all there to make a sandwich. They're just condiments to make a sandwich for the main thing, which would be the meat inside, right? You can't have a pastrami sandwich without pastrami. You would not eat just bread with Masah, with Maror. Yet that's exactly what we do. We make a Masah and Maror sandwich without the meat inside. We just kind of imagine that the meat is there. So the question is, why? How do you know that? Maybe you might think that if there's no Korban, then forget the Matzah also. And so he says, I need that pasuk, right, to say, Lo tochalav chametz. We're talking about the first pasuk here. Shema tochalav masot. This is teaching us that any time that the prohibition of chametz applies, and that applies right all the time nowadays also, it's not related to the korban. So too, anytime that this prohibition of chametz applies, the obligation to eat masah also applies, even if there is no korban pesach. So Torah was kind of looking ahead to the future and saying, I know one day the Bet HaMikdash will be destroyed and you won't have korban pesach. Still, you have to do that. That's very interesting that the Torah is legislating for exilic times. Okay, so that's what he would do with that. Now, turn back. Rabbi Shimon, so Rabbi Shimon, this is a good point that Rabbi Yehudah made. How do you know that you have to eat masah even when there is no korban pesach? Because a different pasuk says, in the evening you should eat masot. So what do you mean in the evening, right? So that means that it's connecting eating masah to the date, right? Mi ba'erev tochel masot. On that day, at night, on the 15th at night, eat masot. It's saying it by itself, right? Regardless of whether there's an actual korban pesach. So that's that pasuk. That's what we use it for. Okay, but Rabbi Yehudah, what is he going to use that pasuk for? That just gives a simple date for the eating of masah. So you have to eat masah. But he already knows that from the different pasuk. Rabbi Yehudah says, I learned, I need that for a different case. Someone who was tameh, when there was a korban pesach, but this person was impure, or he was far away, and he couldn't make it to the Bet HaMikdash in order to prepare korban pesach. So now he's sitting at home, he's tameh, he's in quarantine, and so he's not eating korban pesach. Does he have to eat masah? And so Rabbi Yehudah says, yes, he does. And I learned that from Mi ba'erev tochelu, right? Just that date, even if he doesn't have korban pesach. So now not only when there's no Bet HaMikdash, but also when there is a Bet HaMikdash, someone who's tameh. That's what he learns it from. The might have thought that since he cannot eat korban pesach because he's tameh, maybe he also would not eat masah maror. That's why Rabbi Yehudah uses mi ba'erev tochelu. Good. And how about Rabbi Shimon? Rabbi Shimon, tameh v'sheva b'derech lokal, la yisterich kera, de la gara me'arel u'ben nechar. Rabbi Shimon says, I agree with the halacha, but I don't need a pasuk for tameh because I can join a person who's tameh together with arel, someone who wasn't circumcised, u'ben nechar, or a foreigner. Dichtiv v'chol arel lo yochal bo. Someone who doesn't have a circumcision cannot eat korban pesach. Bo hu eno ochel, aber ocher hu b'masah maror. He doesn't need that, the korban pesach, bo, but the word bo excludes. He only korban pesach, that to the exclusion of masah maror, he does have to eat masah maror. We're talking about a case of like a Jew who doesn't get circumcised for some reason. Maybe it's dangerous for them to get a circumcision. It's life-threatening. And so they, even though they don't have to, they can't be circumcised, still they cannot eat korban pesach, because that's the rule. If you don't have circumcision, you cannot eat korban pesach. They're integrally connected. Nevertheless, that person will still eat matzah and maror. And so if that person has to eat, then tameh also, right? It was all the more so that tameh person has less of a reason not to eat matzah maror, so it's all included. So how about the Yehudah, right? Wasn't he learn it from v'chad le'adel lo yochal bo and include tameh just like Rabbi Shimon did? Yehudah ketib behai uchtib behai. No, it says it in both. It says it regarding tameh and regarding arel. Maybe you think that they might be different. They're different categories, and so it's okay. The Torah has one pasuk for one and one pasuk for the other, and by doing that, we're able to account for both the opinion of Rabbi Yehudah and the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, and we saw how they can explain all of the three Pesukim. And so now that we understand their different opinions, we'll be ready for tomorrow to go back to our Mishnah and ask who is the author of our Mishnah. Baruch Adonai L'olam, amen ve'amen.